The 1948th year of our Lord began not with a prayer, but with the sound of a man's spirit snapping like a frozen branch. In the heart of the Siberian wasteland, where the wind howls with the voices of a million ghosts, the gulag was a tomb for the living. Stephen lay on the wooden slats of his bunk, watching the frost crawl across the ceiling in patterns that looked like skeletal fingers. His stomach was a hollow cavern, a void that had long ago forgotten the weight of real food. Every breath was a struggle against the air that felt like powdered glass in his lungs. This was the environment that birthed the most horrific plan a human mind could conceive. Beside him sat Miller, a man whose face was a map of scars and broken promises. Miller was 60, but in this place, age was measured in survival, not years. He was methodically sharpening a piece of stolen industrial steel against the stone floor. Shh, shh, shh. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, and utterly predatory. Across from them sat Blackjack, a mountain of a man with hands the size of dinner plates and eyes that held no light. They were the wolves of the barracks, and they had spent weeks grooming Stephen. They shared their meager soup with him. They defended him from the casual cruelty of the guards. To Stephen, they were the only family he had left in a world gone mad. It was on the night of the 19th of January that Miller leaned in close, his breath smelling of rot and tobacco. "We're leaving, kid," he whispered. "We found a gap in the perimeter near the lumberyard. Beyond that, it's 300 miles to the railway, but we can make it. We need someone like you, someone with a sharp mind who can read the stars and keep us moving when the cold tries to put us to sleep." Stephen felt a surge of hope so violent it made him dizzy. He was a student of history, a boy who had been arrested for owning the wrong books, and he believed in the inherent nobility of man. He believed Miller and Blackjack saw something in him worth saving. He did not know that in the secret language of the professional Vori, he was already dead. He was the cow, a walking canteen of blood and a moving larder of flesh. They were not taking him because he could read the stars. They were taking him because he was young. His muscles had not yet turned to stringy sinew, and he was naive enough to walk into the white furnace of the taiga on his own 2 feet. It was a logistical masterclass in cannibalism. Why carry meat when the meat can carry itself? They broke out during a blinding blizzard that turned the world into a shifting wall of white. The searchlights were useless, their beams dying just a few feet from the towers. They cut through the wire, the metal shrieking in the wind, and vanished into the trees. For the first 2 days, the adrenaline kept Stephen moving. He felt a manic joy as the camp faded into the distance. Every mile was a victory. Miller and Blackjack were strangely protective. When Stephen stumbled, Blackjack would hoist him up with a grunt of encouragement. When the night grew too cold to bear, they huddled together, placing Stephen in the middle to keep his core temperature high. "You're our ticket out, kid," Miller would say, patting Stephen's thigh with a hand that lingered a second too long. "We gotta keep you prime. We gotta make sure you do not waste away." Stephen smiled, his eyes filling with tears of gratitude. He thought they were preserving his life out of love. He did not realize they were marinating him in hope, keeping his adrenaline low so the meat would not sour with the taste of fear. By the 5th day, the reality of the taiga began to set in. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The bread they had smuggled out was gone, reduced to crumbs at the bottom of their pockets. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree trunk splitting in the frost. Stephen's boots were falling apart, his toes turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked at his companions for guidance, but the mask of brotherhood was beginning to slip. Blackjack no longer smiled. He watched Stephen walk, his eyes fixed on the boy's calves, his throat moving in a rhythmic swallow. Miller became quiet, his gaze distant and calculating. They began to whisper in a slang Stephen did not understand. Words like marbling and jointing drifting through the cold air. The hunger was no longer a dull ache. It was a screaming animal inside them. Stephen noticed that they had stopped eating their own tiny scraps of leather and bark. They were waiting. They were watching him for the first sign of true collapse, for the moment when the cow would no longer be able to walk, and the harvest would begin. On the night of the 25th of January, they found shelter in a limestone cave. Stephen was delirious, his mind wandering back to his university days, to the lectures on the French Revolution and the poetry of Rilke. He babbled about the beauty of the stars, unaware that Miller was standing over him, holding the sharpened steel shard. The moonlight hit the blade, reflecting a sliver of light into Stephen's clouded eyes. In that moment of near-death clarity, the veil was torn away. He saw Blackjack holding a heavy stone, positioned at the foot of his bed of pine boughs. He saw the hunger in their faces, not the hunger of men who wanted to survive, but the hunger of ghouls who had lost their humanity long ago. The shock was so profound it acted like a lightning strike to his nervous system. He did not scream. He did not beg. He simply stared into Miller's eyes and saw the truth. He was not a man to them. He was a commodity. He was a collection of calories. And as Miller raised the blade, the student of history died, and something much older, much darker, was born in the freezing dark of that cave. The blade hovered for a fraction of a second, a silver sliver of moonlight suspended in the freezing air of the cave. Miller's hand was steady, his eyes locked on the pulse in Stephen's neck. But in that heartbeat of hesitation, the boy did something the predators did not expect. He did not flinch. He did not beg for his mother or cry out to a god that had long since abandoned the Siberian taiga. He simply stared, his pupils dilating until his eyes were two black pits of nothingness. Blackjack moved closer, the heavy stone gripped in his calloused hand. "Is he awake?" the giant whispered, his voice like grinding gravel. "Does not matter," Miller hissed back. "The cold will take him by morning anyway. We're just moving up the schedule. I'm tired of walking on an empty stomach when the solution is lying right here, warm and ready." Stephen felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the frost. It was a crystalline realization. His entire life, the books, the history, the lectures on ethics, was a lie. The only truth was the knife. The only morality was the capacity to stay warm. As Miller began to lower the blade, a sudden, violent coughing fit seized Stephen. He rolled onto his side, hacking and gasping, his body convulsing so realistically that Miller instinctively stepped back to avoid the spray of possible sickness. "It's the rot," Blackjack muttered, disgusted. "If his lungs are gone, we should not wait. The meat will spoil." Stephen played the part of the dying animal with a terrifying brilliance. He moaned, his limbs twitching, drifting into what looked like a final coma. He watched through the fringe of his eyelashes as the two men settled back down, deciding to wait for the cover of the pre-dawn darkness to finish the chore. They were tired. Even the monsters were exhausted by the relentless march through the snow. They believed their cow was broken, its spirit extinguished. They did not realize that by stripping away his humanity, they had removed his capacity for fear. As the moon dipped behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, the cave fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Blackjack's snores began to echo off the limestone walls. Miller, the old wolf, took longer to drift off, his hand still resting on the hilt of his shard. Stephen waited. He counted his own shallow breaths, timing them to the rhythm of the wind outside. He felt the weight of the logging axe he had managed to keep near his bedroll, a tool they had let him carry because they wanted him to exhaust his muscles, making the meat tender. He rose not like a man, but like a shadow cast by a flickering flame. There was no sound. The snow muffled the world, and the cave floor was slick with ice that he navigated with the predatory grace of a ghost. He reached Blackjack first. The giant was a mountain of muscle, a fortress of flesh. If he woke, Stephen would be crushed in seconds. Stephen stood over him, the axe raised high. In his mind, he was not killing a man. He was harvesting a resource. He was reclaiming the calories they had stolen from him. The axe fell with a sickening, heavy thud. It split the silence and the bone with equal ease. Blackjack did not even scream. His body gave one singular, violent jolt, his legs kicking out against the stone wall, and then he was still. The sound, however, was enough to bolt Miller upright. The old man was fast. Even in the dark, even in his shock, he rolled toward the exit, the butcher's knife flashing. "You!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and genuine, primal terror. "You little piece of filth! I fed you! I kept you warm!" Stephen did not answer. He did not need words. He stepped into the sliver of light at the cave's mouth, the axe dripping, his face splattered with a dark, steaming red that looked black in the moonlight. He looked at Miller and saw a weak, aging man whose only power was deceit. "You did not feed me, Miller," Stephen finally said, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "You were just fattening the calf. But you forgot one thing about history. Sometimes the calf learns how the butcher thinks." Miller lunged, driven by the desperation of a cornered rat. He was a veteran of 1,000 street fights and prison brawls, but he was fighting a man who had already died once that night. Stephen met the charge, ignoring the knife that sliced deep into his forearm. He swung the axe in a horizontal arc, catching Miller in the ribs. The sound of snapping bone was like a dry branch breaking. Miller fell, gasping, his lungs punctured, his blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. Stephen stood over him, watching the life flicker in the old man's eyes. He felt a strange, intoxicating surge of energy. The hunger was still there, but it was no longer painful. It was a directive. He picked up Miller's sharpened shard, the very tool intended for his own throat, and looked at the two bodies. The snow was falling again, beginning to drift into the cave, a white shroud for the fallen. Stephen knew he could not carry the bodies. He knew the march to the railway was still 200 miles of frozen hell. He looked at the axe, then at the knife, and then at the remains of Blackjack. He remembered Miller's lecture on marbling. He remembered the whispers about the marrow. He knelt down beside the massive corpse of the man who had intended to eat him. With a steady hand and a mind that had completely severed its connection to the world of books and poetry, he began the work. He was no longer a student. He was no longer a victim. He was the master of the harvest. By the time the sun rose on the 26th of January, 1948, Stephen was the only living thing in the cave, and he was no longer hungry. The final 200 miles were not a journey of a man, but the migration of a ghost. Stephen moved across the white expanse of the tundra like a shadow that refused to fade with the sun. The weather turned into a permanent, screaming gale, the temperature plunging so low that the very air seemed to freeze and shatter against his skin. But Stephen did not feel the cold. He was fueled by a dark, internal furnace, a caloric fire harvested from the very men who had branded him a cow. He had constructed a sled from the boughs of cedar and the heavy leather belts of Blackjack. Upon this sled, he kept his supplies. He had become a master of the frozen craft, utilizing the sub-zero temperatures to preserve the meat, carving only what he needed for each day's strength. His mind, once a library of dates and names, had narrowed into a singular, sharp point of survival. He no longer thought of the French Revolution. He thought of the distribution of fat. He no longer recited Rilke. He calculated the distance to the next tree line by the rhythm of his own heart. By the beginning of March 1948, Stephen's appearance had transcended the horrific. His skin had taken on a translucent, waxy quality, and his eyes had retreated so deep into his skull They looked like flickering embers in a cave. He wore Miller's coat over Blackjack's sweater, a composite monster made of the garments of the dead. He spoke to the sled. He told the remains of Miller about the beauty of the frost. He thanked the ghost of Blackjack for the strength in his legs. The line between the eater and the eaten had vanished entirely. They were one organism now, moving toward the edge of the map. On the afternoon of the 12th of March, a group of workers at a remote logging station near the Yenisei River saw a figure cresting the final ridge. At first, they thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, or a forest spirit born of the blizzard. The figure dragged a heavy load, leaving a deep, dark trench in the virgin snow. As it drew closer, the loggers dropped their saws and axes, paralyzed by the sight. It was a man, or the wreckage of one, his face a mask of frost and dried brown stains, his breath coming out in ragged, crystalline clouds. The foreman, a stout man named Ivan, ran forward with a heavy wool blanket. "Easy, lad, you're safe. You've made it," he shouted, his voice cracking with pity. He reached out to take the rope of the sled, intending to lighten the survivor's load. Stephen did not collapse. He did not weep. He lunged forward with a snarl that was purely animal, snatching the rope back with a claw-like hand. "Do not touch the provisions," Stephen rasped. His voice was no longer that of a student. It was the sound of stones grinding together at the bottom of a glacier. "They were very kind to me. They gave me everything. I won't not let you steal them now." The loggers gathered around, their faces pale. One of them, a younger boy, caught a glimpse beneath the tattered tarp of the sled. He saw a hand, gray, frozen, and missing 2 fingers protruding from a bundle of rags. He saw the curve of a rib cage, stripped clean with the precision of a jeweler. The boy turned away and vomited into the snow. "Son," Ivan said, his voice trembling as he stepped back, Those are men, your comrades." Stephen looked at Ivan, and for a moment the old light of the history student flickered in his eyes, replaced instantly by a terrifying, lucid coldness. He stood tall, pulling the weight of his sins closer to his heels. "Comrades?" Stephen whispered. He began to laugh, a high, melodic sound that seemed to vibrate in the frozen air. "They were not comrades. They were a promise. They told me I would not starve. They told me I was the key to their survival." He took a step toward the crowd of well-fed, horrified men. He sniffed the air, smelling the salt of their sweat and the warmth of the bread in their pockets. His hand went instinctively to the sharpened steel shard at his belt. "They were right," Stephen said, his gaze fixed on the foreman's throat. "I did not starve. I learned the lesson they wanted to teach me. In this world, you are either the one holding the knife or the one waiting for it." The authorities arrived 2 days later to find Stephen sitting in a locked shed, refusing to enter the warm barracks. He sat on his sled, cradling a bleached skull as if it were a holy relic. When the soldiers tried to take the remains away for burial, Stephen fought with a ferocity that required 4 grown men to pin him down. He did not scream for mercy. He screamed about the waste, about the loss of good stock. The story of the Scholar of the Taiga became a dark legend, whispered in the corridors of power, in the corners of bars. But the most chilling detail came from the doctor who examined him before his final transfer to a high-security asylum. The doctor noted that Stephen was in remarkably good health. His muscles were dense, his blood count high. He was the healthiest man to ever emerge from a 300-mile trek through a famine-stricken wasteland. In his final statement to the court, Stephen refused to plead insanity. He stood in the dock, dressed in a clean suit that looked alien on his hardened frame, and addressed the judge with a calm, terrifying elegance. "You weep for the 2 men on my sled," Stephen said, his voice echoing through the silent room. "But you do not understand. They are not dead. They are in my blood. They are in the strength of my arms. I did not kill them to end them. I killed them to become them. And now, as I look at all of you, so warm and so certain of your safety, I realize the only mistake I made. He paused, a faint, predatory smile touching his lips. I should have stayed in the woods, Stephen whispered, his eyes scanning the jury like a butcher surveying a herd. There is so much more of you here, and you are all so very, very soft. The courtroom fell into a deathly silence as the realization sank in. The boy they had tried to save had not just survived the cannibal's trap, he had fallen in love with the hunger.